I'm going to try to work one bit of cowboy slang in every time. Leakier than a porcupine's raincoat, by the way, not cowboy slang. I had to go somewhere else to find that.
All right, Jacob, we're entering the part of the season where fantasy managers are either clinging to their playoff hopes or they are looking for edges to stay ahead. So let's give them some must starts, right? Some guys who are instant locks this week. And the first guy who's played pretty well recently is one running back, Rico Dowdle, of the Panthers. Give us your reasoning behind why Dowdle's a must start.
Yeah, this is more of an affirmation than anything else because Chuba Hubbard returned from his injury last week and he was the starter ahead of Dowdle. But Dave Canales has made it clear both running backs are going to get a fair share of the workload and they're going to, both be a factor in this offense. And we saw that play out with Dowdle ending up having the better game of the two last week. Now he's playing a Bills defense that has given up the fifth most fantasy points per game to running backs and 8 total touchdowns. So he's a threat to get into the end zone again. I just like the matchup. So, guys, if you have Rico Dowdle, don't be too afraid of Chuba Hubbard. And hey, if you have a Chuba Hubbard, fire him up as well. These guys are going to get a lot of touches each week. One of them's always going to have a better game than the other, maybe get a handful more touches, and it's going to vary week to week. But both are still worth starting in this matchup because the Bills' run defense just isn't very good.
All right, Jacob. There's Swiss cheese, and then there's whatever's happening with the Cowboys defense, which means any opposing offense is playing the Cowboys defense, including this wide receiver, will have an opportunity. So why don't you give fantasy managers at home why Troy Franklin should be starting this week?
Yeah, you mentioned the Cowboys' pass defense. It's terrible. Let's just be honest. They've allowed a league high 12 receiving touchdown to wide receivers this year. It's not going to get better anytime soon. They don't really have reinforcements coming. They have some decent cornerbacks, but the problem is they can't generate a consistent pass rush, Joe, and we all know why that might be the case. Maybe if they hadn't made that big preseason trade, Micah Parsons, their defense would look better. But they made that trade, so their pass defense isn't very good. They're not going to be able to consistently pressure Bo Nix. That's going to allow him to throw to Troy Franklin. So averaging a solid 6.6 targets per game, has good chemistry with Bo Nix dating back to their days at Oregon. So, if you're going to take a dart throw on these Denver receivers, I'd go with Franklin over Marvin Mims. Both are worthwhile candidates, but I think Franklin's going to get more of the targets and opportunities.
What have you seen from Bo Nix this year, Jacob? I'm just curious.
Yeah, he's been a little bit up and down, kind of hot and cold. I think the Giants game's a great example of what we've seen from him. He had 3 quarters of the game where you were like, man, he just really can't matriculate the ball downfield enough. It's not necessarily he's having trouble reading the defense, just having trouble finding open weapons. But then once things start to click for him, once he starts to understand how to attack the defense, he's able to make plays both with his arm and his legs. So, he hasn't taken a step back. He hasn't taken a major step forward, but I think the Broncos fans should still be encouraged by what they're seeing. There's going to always be some uneven play, especially from second year quarterbacks. Yeah, we've even seen that with, Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. He's had some up and down performances through injuries this year. So the fact that Bo Nix is keeping the Broncos competitive, even in games where it looked like they were going to get blown out, that's a good sign for him. So, am I overly excited by what I'm seeing? Not necessarily, but I think that they can still continue to win games with him, which is all you're looking for.
All right, Jacob, let's move to the last of your must start players here. And this should really make Joe, this one behind me, this should make Joe Namath a little bit happy when he hears this must start. And that's tight end Mason Taylor. Now, he look like he might be a little bit of a player at the tight end spot, but going as far to say he's a must start, you have to explain that one to me, Jacob.
Yeah, look, I know the Jets offense is bad, but it sounds like they're going to switch quarterbacks this week. Tyrod Taylor coming in, maybe it's a little bit of a friskier passing game. Maybe he can get the ball. He's a veteran passer. Maybe he'll be able to get the ball to his weapons a little bit more. But really, this is more of a fate of the Bengals defense, which has been absolutely terrible against, like, unfathomably bad against tight ends. I know you watched the Steelers Bengals game last week because we were both working during it. And the Bengals in that game allowed 4 receiving touchdowns to tight ends, 3 different ones. Jonnu Smith, Pat Fryermuth, Darnell Washington all had. My boy, that dude is huge. We have no idea how big he is, but he's 6'7" and probably 300 pounds. It's like an offensive tackle on tight end position. But anyway, I digress. Mason Taylor is now going to get a chance to face this defense that has allowed 9 total touchdowns, 4 last week to tight ends. I mean, look, if he gets in the end zone, that's automatically going to put him in play as a top 10 tight end. So I'm willing to stake my claim to him. I'm going to back pretty much every tight end playing the Bengals until they show any semblance of an ability to stop the position.
All right, Jacob. So we gave fantasy managers some sleepers and we also gave them some must starts. But for fantasy managers looking to avoid players to play this week, let's give them some must sits. So this one again, no risk it, no biscuit. Sometimes you got to get spicy, right? And Dakota Rain Prescott, Dak Prescott is a must sit this week for you. Tell the fantasy managers why they should risk that.
Yeah, so I know that it's going to be hard for fantasy managers to sit Dak Prescott. I own him in, I think, all of the leagues that I'm in, quite literally. So I get it. He's had at least 3 touchdowns in 4 consecutive games, but this Broncos defense does not profile as a good matchup for him. Patrick Surtain's going to take away one of CD Lamb or George Pickens on the outside, and they've allowed no more than 1 passing touchdown in 5 of their 7 games this year. So, that alone is enough to be like, I don't know if Prescott's going to have a high ceiling this week. But then you add in the fact that Denver has one of the best pass rushes in the league. Dak Prescott's passer rating when pressured drops to 82.6, which isn't bad, but it's well below his peak at the position. And he just has historically not done as well under pressure. So I'm worried about him having one of his bump in the road type games where you're like, oh, he only had 1 touchdown. He got sacked a handful of times. He had an interception. So I just think he has a much lower ceiling than normal. I get it. It's by Mageddon. Not everyone is going to be positioned to sit him. But if you do have another option, I would at least consider it and just say, hey, Prescott's going to have at least 1 dud moving forward at some point, and this looks like the spot it might be.
The Cleveland Browns are coming off a big win this past weekend, but one of their star rookies is not making any starting lineups for you, Jacob, and that's Quinshon Judkins. Tell the people why he's a must-sit this week.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are going to be excited about what he did against the Miami Dolphins, but we've talked about this before. The Dolphins are absolutely terrible against the run. They've allowed more rushing yards to the running back position than any team in the league. And Judkins, yeah, he had 3 touchdowns last week. Not going to be able to have that type of success against the Patriots, who have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to running backs and only 2 rushing touchdowns on the entire season. So, there's a possibility that Judkins could find the end zone, but I think it's more likely that the Patriots are going to find a way to limit him, try to make Dylan Gabriel beat them. So I just think game script is going to go away from Judkins in this one. Again, it's by Mageddon. Not everyone's going to be positioned to sit him. But if you're deep at running back or you have other flex options at receiver you can put in place of him, I would at least consider it this week. I think he has a really low floor and the ceiling just really isn't there, especially if he's not going to get a touchdown.
All right, Jacob, Baltimore has been more like bolted less this season. That's a terrible joke. I'm sorry. It's just, we can laugh about it, but it's all anyway. But wide receiver Zay Flowers makes one of your must-sit players for week 8. Tell the people why versus the Bears defense Zay Flowers should sit.
Yeah, so quietly, Chicago's pass defense has improved pretty significantly during their 4-game winning streak. They've only allowed 201.5 passing yards per game during that span, and that's coincided with their secondary getting healthier. They had a lot of players out with injury earlier in this season, but now they are getting those players back. Ben Johnson, kind of everything's starting to gel under him, and Dennis Allen, their defensive coordinator there. So I think those players are going to be able to limit Flowers a little bit more, and we just don't know if Lamar Jackson is going to play in this game. If he does, then you're probably going to start Flowers. But if he doesn't, while he's still dealing with that hamstring injury, I don't really want to trust Flowers with Cooper Rush at quarterback. Flowers hasn't scored since week 1, so it's just going to keep his floor low if, Cooper Rush is out there. And Flowers is a little guy. I think he's like 5'9" and 195 pounds, something along those lines. So doesn't profile as a big red zone threat anyway. So he's more of a guy that you're going to want when Lamar is in the lineup to rack up yards, but that's not going to happen with Cooper Rush at quarterback.
All right, partner. I know last week you said, Big Take Jake, that Tez Johnson would go for over 125 yards, and that didn't happen. Came up dry at the well. But Big Take Jake is back once again to give the people a bold prediction. So tell us, Big Take Jake, what you got for us this week, partner.
All right, partner, we're trusting one of them oldest Cowboys in the league this time around. We're rolling with Aaron Rodgers to have his third game of the season with at least 4 touchdowns. Now, this might seem crazy on the surface. The Packers are middle of the road against quarterbacks and have allowed multiple passing touchdowns in 4 of their last 5 games. We've seen Rodgers buck up for revenge games in Week 1 against the New York Jets. He should do it again in Week 8, especially if the Steelers' defense remains leakier than a porcupine's raincoat and turns this into an old-fashioned Wild West shootout. So, hey, make sure Aaron Rodgers is in your fantasy lineups. Make sure he's out there while he racks up a bunch of touchdowns, and we'll see if he can get to 4 once again.
Skin that smoke wagon.